Now, we saw how to do the into scene, the select screen, and right now we are over here on our actual level where we're going to fight. This is the canvas. Health bars are just sliders, and we're going to create the level manager and the level UI. The level UI is mostly going to hold references to the actual UI. References such as the announcer text, which is line 1 or line 2. This is basically for effect. The level timer over here. The sliders, as I mentioned. The win indicator grids are on the canvas. There are a few grids under the player text, which basically, if you create on the prefabs you have, if you drop win indicator and start duplicating, it will create them in turn like this, so you do not have to write code to place the indicators somewhere. And the win indicator is the prefab I just mentioned. Let's move on. Let's see the level UI. The references I said are just this. Okay. Text, slider, an array of game objects which has the win indicator grids, the actual prefab for the win indicator, and it's also a singleton, and we have a function that says add win indicator to the corresponding player. So we pass an integer for the player we want to add a win indicator, and it goes and instantiates the win indicator prefab to the whatever transform you want to have, doesn't matter, whatever rotation, as a game object, and then goes and sets parent to the win indicator grid for that player and makes it a child of that transform, and that in turn makes the grid work and places them in a line. Now keep in mind that the grids on the left start on the upper left, and the grids on the right and everything else from its side are basically the opposite. Okay, start corner, upper right, child alignment, upper right. And we're ready to see the level manager. Inside my level there is also, okay, there is a box underneath it that stands for the floor, a box collider, and there is a game object with two spawn positions. Okay, that is completely arbitrary, you can place it wherever you want. And let's see the level manager, and we come over here, and this has a lot of meat into it. We need references to the scene manager, and since we're using lists, now we need to start with the wait for seconds, which is what we use to wait inside coroutines. We will be using this a lot, so that's why we're going to initialize an array with spawn positions. This needs to be set up from the inspector. Reference to the character manager, reference to the level UI. Maximum turns is at how many turns the game is going to end. So if somebody gets 2 victories, that means he wins. The current turn we are. Now the current turn is the current turn, what turn we are. And we have some variables for the countdown. If we are actually because sometimes we need to know if we are actually counting or not, then we make this into public. Now maximum turn timer is at how many turn at what time, or basically how many seconds before the turn ends. Now keep in mind that this is an integer, and you'll see why. On start, we set up the reference to the character manager and the level UI. We initialize the 1 sec. I'm just setting it up to be 1 second. And we also go and close the announcer text line 1 and 2. Okay, we're not needing it over here. And we start our main loop on the first turn we're going to run. We're going to run it by using a coroutine which is called start game. So before we're going to fixed update and handle the timer, we're going to come into start game. The first time we're going to fight, we need to call another coroutine that actually creates the players, and it comes over here. So it goes into the character manager we saw on the previous video. For every player in there, it's going to go and instantiate the prefabs we have assigned into them, basically from the select screen. It will instantiate them, and it will instantiate them on the spawn position. If it's 0, it's supposed to be the first player. If it's 1, it's supposed to be the second player. So it will spawn them either left or right. And it's going to assign the next references we're going to use. One will be the player states into that character manager on the player base we saw. And from that created game object, that created player, is going to go and call get component state manager. So from there it can it sets up the reference over here, so next time we need it, we know where to find it. It's also going to assign the health slider. The first health slider will be for the first player, the second will be for the second. Okay, simple as that. You return, let's make that null actually. Doesn't need to wait for the end of the turn. Okay. It's going to, when this coroutine ends, it's going to go back over here and it's going to call the next coroutine, which is the initialize turn. And this is a coroutine we're going to be calling every time we're starting a new turn. So in order to init the new turns, we still need to disable the announcer lines. Okay, because we'll be calling it every time we need to start a new turn. We basically don't want this. We reset the timer, so the current timer will be the maximum turn timer, and countdown will be false. We have already created the players, okay, and we keep this separate because there's no point to recreating the players if we already have them. We only want them to have the first time we're going to be starting the fight. Okay, so we now need to simply initialize them. So we go into every player that is actually created. Okay, and here's where we need the reference to the player state. We basically say their health to be 100. Health is an integer over here. We reset the animation they are playing by using. Right now we haven't made the handle animation, so just write what you see over here and comment this out. Okay, basically the handle animation is a script that handles the animation, of course, and it has a public variable of the animator, and you can access the animator over here. The other way you can do it is, instead of doing this, you do something like this: player states dot transform dot get component animator. Okay, instead of doing this, since we already have the reference to the handle animator, we can do that. I'll delete this one, I'll keep this one. and I'll keep this one too. And the next thing we also need to do is reset the position for each player to be still the spawn position. If we do not want this, if we comment this out, then it will start every player, every character on the same position they ended the previous player. You might want to use this, you might not want to use this, that's entirely up to you. Some games do it, some others don't, and I think X-Men vs Marvel didn't have this. Actually started the turn the last place they ended the previous one, but it just make them to separate a bit or something like that. You can do something else. Yeah, we end the coroutine over here. We initialize the players, but what we need to do now is enable the controls. But we can either enable the controls completely or directly, or we can do something else for some more flair. And that something else we're going to do is we're going to enable the text line, and we're going to say change the text. It's going to say turn and pass the current turn. It's going to say turn 1, turn 2 and everything else. Okay, we're going to change the color, and here's where the wait for seconds we've initialized on the start comes into play. Now, since I know this has this is always 1 second, I can actually add it over here. So I want them to wait 2 seconds. Now the other way I could have done this is do new wait for seconds. Okay, this too is the same as this one, but since you are mostly going to use just 1 second, it's entirely up to you if you want to create either a new wait for seconds or if you want to do it this way. If you want to benchmark this, then be my guest. I'm not even going to bother with this, so I'll delete it. So wait 2 seconds, change the text to 3, change the color to green, wait 1 second, change the text to 2, change the color to yellow, wait 1 second, change the color, change the text to 1, change the color to red, wait 1 second, change the color text to fight. The color will still be red, or if you want to do another color, you can do it. And then for every player you need to enable, we're actually going to check what type of player it is. If it's a user, you can have a switch statement instead of if statements. We'll see if we're going to change this in the future. Okay, if it's a user, then we reference its input handler. We actually assign it. We go, since we have the player states, you can think it as the world object. It's the actual character we've created into the level we will fight. Okay, so we reference its game object and we say get component input handler, and we go into the input handler, into player input, we assign the input ID. This is the thing that we said, the input ID. Okay, what keys control that exact character, and we say input handler enable to true. So next we wait 1 more second and we disable the text line, the first text line, and we say countdown to true, and you start decreasing on the timer. And that's basically how you start one turn. Okay, this is completely optional. We have enabled the control. The game starts, the fight starts, so we can come into fixed update and then update. Now for fixed update, basically it checks if the first player X position is lower than the second player's, then it just go into the stage, look right, and makes for the one player, for the first player makes it true, for the other makes it false, and vice versa. Now we're going to see that on the next video, on the next part, more into detail. I'll just leave a bookmark actually, so that I do not forget, and I'll continue. On update, if we are actually have enabled the countdown, we can say handle turn timer. How we handle the turn timer? On the level UI, the level timer, and the text we have will equals the current timer. We have the value over here, the integer, to string. Okay, so we output that there. We have an internal timer that counts with time.delta time. Now this is going to be frame dependent. Okay, so if it runs on 20 frames per second, then that means that whenever the time delta is, I think that's also frame dependent. Yeah, it is frame dependent. I know that for sure. So anyway, basically when the internal timer is greater than 1, it's going to reset the internal timer and it's going to subtract from the current timer. Since the current timer is integers, okay, you cannot simply decrease them on every frame, because that means in 1 second you actually decreased 60 times your integer. So that means it's not an accurate reason. It's not an accurate timer. Okay, then we continue on. If the current timer is equals or lower than 0, that means the countdown is over. We call the function that actually turns the function, and it takes a boolean. It already has a boolean timeout, which is already initialized as false, but if I want to pass it, since it's all timeout, it's basically a way to call this function and know if the turn was ended because somebody lost all health or the timer ran out. Okay, in this case the timer ran out, so we call it with true, countdown equals false, so it stops counting. And we come over here and turn function, which is not the actual function that ends the turn. So we say stop counting down. We need to add this over here because when they run out of health, they will still call this function. Okay, we reset the timer, or you want to do that later, doesn't matter. Now if it's a timeout, we change the announcer text we first enabled, of course, and we say timeout. We change the color. Now if it wasn't a timeout, we say we still enable the text line and we say KO or everything else you want to add. We change the color. We disable the controls. We call the function that disables the controls, and it goes into each player. Each player has also a function inside the state manager, which we will see into more detail later, which is over here, which basically resets all the variables it has. So for right now, on your state manager, on your empty state manager you have, just basically add this public function, and it is not necessary to add anything else in here. We're going to see it on the next part. Okay, so if it's a user player, then for that player you need to disable the controls, you need to disable the input handler. Okay, simple as that. If it's an AI, you need to disable the script that controls the AI, and we'll see when we see that. Disable control. We have disabled the controls, and then we're actually calling the coroutine that actually ends the turn, and it's this one. Wait 3 seconds, so the text line will show either the timeout or the KO. We need to find what was the winning player anyway, and we do that by calling this function, find winning player. Let's go to definition, and it's this function. Who won the turn? We start with our return value we initialized by null, and we also need to have target player, and we also need to initialize that by null. We first need to see if both players have equal health. So if player 1 and player 2 do not have equal health, that means it's not a draw. So if they do not have equal health, then we check if the first player has lower health than the second player, that means the second player won. So we go into the character manager, into the player base. On the second player we say score plus plus, we add 1 to his score. On the target player, and we actually need to reset the score, and I forgot that, so we'll see it in a bit. The target player will be the second player, and on the level UI you go and call the function to add 1 win indicator for the second player. Now if it's the opposite, if the first player has more health than the second player, then that means that do the same but for the first player. Okay, so add the score of the first player, add the target player will be the first player, and add 1 win indicator to the first player, and we say the return value will be from the character manager, find the player that corresponds the created the world object belongs to from the target player. Okay, and return the return value. Now if both players were the same, had the same health, that means it was a draw. That means the return value will be null, and we do the check over here. Okay, find the winning player, and we say if the victorious player, or W player if you want to have instead of V player anyway, if the victor player return null, then that means nobody won, it's a draw. Change the text to draw, change the color to blue, else that player is the winner. Change the text to say that player ID wins, change the color to red. Wait 3 seconds, and then in case the winning player didn't take any damage at all, so you check to see first if you actually have a winning player, so it's not null. Okay, then its health equals 100, so he didn't take any damage at all, or you can add a different equation over here, or a different statement. Then open up the second line, the second announcer line, and say flawless victory. Okay, simple as that. Wait 3 seconds, add to the current turn, to the turn counter, and you say, is the match over? You call the boolean over here. You start by false. Okay, and you check for every player. You check to see if that the return value will be true. Basically, if the score is equals or higher than the maximum turns you can have in your fight, then the return value will be true. You break the for loop and return that return value. So basically, it's going to return true or not. If it's true, if it's not true, you will start the coroutine to initialize the turn, and you start the loop for the next turn again. Okay, in goes. Basically, it covers back to everything else we've done. If the match was over, then you need to come over here and say, for every character, make the character manager, make him say that he doesn't have a character, so has character equals false, and load the select screen. And here where we can say character manager all players i.score equals 0. Now, before you make that into 0, you can actually save it into a different file or serialize it so that nobody can access it, or they can access it, but they cannot access it just as easy as like using the player prefs. Okay, and you can have high scores and stuff like that, basically from saving the results of the match over here instead of making the score to be 0. Okay, and the level manager is also a singleton, but we're going to see that on the next part. So this on init turn, if the match isn't over, it's going to come over here, the init turn, and it's going to go through it once more and restart the loop of your level. That's basically for the level manager, and we're going to see that it's what actually controls the fight. And on the next part, we're going to see how we actually move our characters and our fighters.